The subject of my research is the discursive construction of the Islamic threat in the Russia of the early 2000s. For my post-structuralist approach, what I tried to do in my research was to analyze the federal anti-terrorist discourse during and after the Second Chechen War, conceived as a wide set of practices and statements intended to re-articulate the system of meaning surrounding the Chechen question, and thus reshaping the social perception of the conflict. As I shall explain, I studied separately the image of the threat on the general and on the individual level. This is, the portrayal of the Chechen social group as the embodiment of the Islamic threat to Russia, and the image of the individual Chechen terrorists. So, I will start by explaining the objectives, methods, and sources of my research. We'll go through some theoretical considerations. I will explain why I speak of an anti-terrorist discourse. The elements and practices outlining the Islamic threat will be analyzed. As we will see, I focused mainly in the statements of high-ranking political leaders, in the language of the written press, and the federal laws on terrorism. I will swiftly elaborate on the cultural basis for the creation of the image of the Chechen terrorist as a new enemy of state in the 2000s. And finally, I will present a particular case study, that of Zara Murtazaliyeva. So, what I try to do is to explore the content, the logics, the elements, and deployment of an anti-terrorist discourse. First, I studied the symbolic and institutional practices outlining the Islamic threat at a collective level. As I said, Chechens embodying the jihadist threat. But then, in order to get into the details of such discourse, analyzed the relations between the formulation of the Islamic threat at the abstract or general level and its individual incarnation. This is the image of the individual Chechen terrorist. For this, I delved into a particular case study, a fabricated criminal affair of terrorism in Moscow, that of the young Chechen student Zara Murtazaliyeva in 2004. Through this case study, I tried to explore from the inside and at a very concrete level the fine points of the anti-terrorist discourse. This is what features or characteristics brand someone a terrorist, according to the general discourse. I will not enter into the details of the affair because of the time, of course, but according to Russian and international human rights organizations, this was a fabricated affair presented later as an achievement on the war on terror. This happened at the moment when the so-called Black Widows carried out several suicide attacks across the Russian Federation. Let us remind that the term Black Widows was created by the media in the 2000s in order to designate young Chechen females carrying on suicide bombings. These women were perceived as the spearhead of Chechen Islamic terrorism. So why is the Murtazaliyeva affair relevant to understand the content, the logics, and deployment of the anti-terrorist discourse? Because given that it was a fabricated affair, the concerned authorities placed on the person of the detainee the characteristics or the features considered deviant, dangerous, or undesirable according to the macro level of the stated threat. In this sense, actually Murtazaliyeva was, let's say, a blank sheet in which these deviant features that typify a terrorist were placed. Not surprisingly, a certain accordance is observed between both levels of threat. On this presentation, I will emphasize the following point. Parting from the post-structuralist assumptions that threats are not external or objective entities, but instead discursive constructions, and I will explain this assumption thoroughly, the Islamic threat came to appear as such by virtue of the anti-terrorist discourse, and not the reverse. Once again, the Islamic threat came to appear as such by virtue of the anti-terrorist discourse, and not the reverse. As for the sources of the research, we can divide them in two distinct groups of corpora, in line with the macro and micro levels of the deployment of the discourse. For the general collective level, I applied discourse analysis to relevant official press releases, to speeches of high-ranking political leaders, to the legal instruments used in the fight against terrorism, mainly the anti-terrorist law of 2006 and the anti-extremist law of 2002, and to different newspaper articles between 1999 and 2012. Let us remember that the language used by media was crucial for the consolidation of the image of the new enemy of state. As to the individual level, I conducted open interviews with actors having intervened in the affair Murtazaliyeva, the detainee herself, her lawyer, representatives of human rights organizations, and journalists having written on her case at the epoch. Representatives of the governmental agencies involved in the affair could not be interviewed. So these interviews helped me see the way that the data I knew was depicted. This is which categories were used during the trial. Besides, I applied discourse analysis on the article speaking of the affair from two newspapers representing opposite views of the affair, Российская Газета, mouthpiece of state, and the critical Novye Izvestia. For the first, Murtazalieva was a terrorist, for the second, a political prisoner. Limitations on time, resources, and space prevented me to analyze other forms of media, TV, radio, etc. And finally, I applied discourse analysis to the verdict of Murtazalieva. So, let's revise briefly some theoretical considerations of my research. First of all, why do I speak of an anti-terrorist discourse? For post-structuralism, a discourse is a system of meanings, ideas, meaningful practices, and statements that obey common rules of operation and that form the identity of subjects and objects. A discourse has a performative capability. Every object is constructed by discourses focusing on it, and so no extra discursive approach to social objects is possible. This also goes for the political notion of threats to national security. Threats are not objective or let's say external entities, but it appears that there's a certain set of phenomena that becomes a threat because the state labels them as such. It is in this sense that I hold the assumption that it is by virtue of the Russian anti-terrorist discourse that the Islamic menace came to appear as such. Something turns into a threat in relation to the state. Something turns into a threat because of the performative action of the state. Certainly, by this I'm not saying that there were no organized individuals engaged into terrorist activities, but they are a threat to national security within a certain a discourse. In our case, the delimitation of what was called the terrorist threat encompassed all sorts of opposition in the Caucasus, no matter if there were Salafists or not, religious or not, etc. So, in terms of Laclos and Mouffe, the state, in our case assisted by media, rearticulated signifying elements available in the discursive field around the nodal point of Islamic terrorism. A nodal point is a central signifier, a point of reference, which stabilizes the discourse and confers a particular meaning to each signifying element. In our case, the signifying elements are, for example, jihad, independence, war, Wahhabism, separatism, etc. Thus, social identities are reshaped by a certain discourse. This is the case of the group Chechens, to whom a collective terrorist identity was assigned. So, by this rearticulation of meanings, the Second Chechen War was presented as a conflict where the hostile forces of international Islamic terrorism struck the Russian Federation from the inside. I should add that this reinterpretation of signifying elements in light of the new nodal point is predicated on the basis of pre-existing negative representations, as we shall see. For the terrorist discourse, the Chechen, who in Russian culture has always been the savage, the rebel, the gangster, reassumes henceforth his status of agent of illegality by plunging now into terrorist activities. So, what's the content of the anti-terrorist discourse? What concrete practices and symbolic operations led to a change in the social perception of the Chechen post-colonial conflict? By 1999, a new representation of the threat to Russian national security appeared in the official discourse. Chechen Islamic terrorism, supposedly under the sway of international jihadist networks. The official anti-terrorist discourse, which was established by the federal government with very concrete political goals since 1999, amalgamates all forms of heteronomy or divergence from federal political projects in the Caucasus under the label of jihadism, terrorism, or Wahhabism, be it nationalists headed at the moment by Maskhadov, moderate autonomists, or existing neo-Salafist organizations. Let us remember that during the very unpopular First War of 1994, the federal official argument for the preservation, for starting the war, was a preservation of constitutional order vis-à-vis a violation of the territorial integrity of Russia. But the main justification for undertaking the second war was the defense of Russia from jihadist forces or from the ill-defined Wahhabis. Let us also remember that the combination of two events led to the beginning of the second war and the retaking of Chechnya. First, the invasion of Basayev to Dagestan in August 1999, as we all know. But first and foremost, the sequence of intentional explosions in apartment buildings in Russian cities, including Moscow. So here the federal government amalgamated the explosions in Moscow, the Islamist attack to Dagestan, and Maskhadov's independent government, who did nonetheless condemn both the bombings and the attack to Dagestan. Chechnya was then presented as the regional platform for the spread of jihad in Russia. And as federal troops took Grozny, a blur appeared in the official discourse as to the following question: is the war against Chechnya or against terrorism? So, the speeches of high-ranking Russian leaders give account on this blur. Just to cite one example, in September 1999, when then Prime Minister Putin was asked about the ongoing air attacks over Grozny, he answered by uttering his well-known response: "We'll chase the terrorists everywhere. If they're in an airport, then in the airport. So if we find them in the toilet, excuse me, we'll rub them out in the outhouse. And that's it, case closed." So attacking Grozny meant attacking the terrorists. And by that time, when the negotiations proposed by Maskhadov were rejected, it was implied that no negotiation with terrorists was conceivable. I will not elaborate for long on this because of the time, but in many official declarations, Maskhadov is compared to Bin Laden or to Al-Qaeda leaders. So, since 1999, Russian authorities have replaced in their language the words nationalists or separatists by terrorists and bandits, when talking not only of Islamist organizations, but also of Chechen nationalist leaders. Besides, it is to note that the foreign element of the Chechen jihad is often emphasized in public speeches, enabling thus the interpretation of Russia being aggressed by external forces. According to the official discourse, these international jihadist networks were using Chechens in their war against Russia. These linguistic changes are also observable in the written press. According to the interviews as well as to relevant secondary sources, the adoption of the official language by media obeyed different logics. For example, gradual monopolization of media, direct governmental control, self-censorship, mainly after Politkovskaya assassination, even the quest for scoops, and ultimately the instauration of a new common sense on Chechen terrorism. But for example, expressions like Chechensky Sled or Chechen Truck, when covering suicide attacks, became widespread in written media. In this expression, there is no distinction between the categories of Chechens and terrorists, and thus it reinforces their association. A direct link between the attacks and Caucasians and not just Islamic groups is established by the repetition of this phrase. As to the so-called Black Widows, this category was created by the media and became widespread after the Dubrovka theater attack. Most of the suicide attacks in Chechnya and in Russian cities in the early 2000s were executed by young Chechen women. A gender-biased representation seems to be the rule when portraying female terrorism, and not only in the Chechen case. The sentimental dimension and references to social expectations regarding femininity are usually highlighted. Black Widows are depicted as women that carry out terrorist attacks seeking revenge for the loss of a loved one during the wars. Such an assumption helps circumvent a thorough explanation of the profound motivations of terrorism, of engaging into terrorism. As it has been said, laws and judicial practice are important parts of the deployment of the anti-terrorist discourse. Through interviews with relevant actors, it became evident that fabricated affairs on terrorism were common in order to nourish the idea of a looming terrorist threat. Caucasians were usually the target of this practice. Police officers, FSB agents, agents of the Interior Ministry, and the courts seem to work together on these cases. Once again, please understand me well, I'm not saying that there were no people engaging in terrorist activities in Russian cities. But I am pointing out that there were institutional or institutionalized practices aimed to highlight the looming terrorist threat. I do not have time for The legal cornerstone of the fight against terrorism is the federal law on counteraction of terrorism of 2006. In this law, the definition of terrorism is deliberately wide and ambiguous. It is defined not only as the commission of violent actions in order to terrorize population, but also as any ideology advocating violence. It goes without saying that any kind of political divergence regarding the Caucasus is labeled as an ideology advocating violence and racial hatred. Even more, among other interesting dispositions, communicating information that may help terrorists is also considered as a terrorist activity. In the practice, this ambiguity serves political ends. For instance, hampering counter-discourses or dissent of organized social actors in the name of the fight against terrorism. The same goes for the anti-extremist law of 2002. It was amended in 2007 in order to extend the notion of extremism, including the incitement to religious, racial or political hatred, as well as hatred or hostility towards any social group. Once again, criticism toward abuse of power in the fight against terrorism is considered as incitement to hatred towards Russians. Many human rights organizations in the North Caucasus and in Moscow were banned because of charges of extremism, but by this I'm not saying nothing new. So, the possibility, once again, well, one example, but this shouldn't be here actually, but one example of the language of the media. It's from the same day actually, but, well, the possibility, I come back to the laws. This shouldn't be here actually, well. The possibility to establish anti-terrorist operations areas, KTO, contemplated by the anti-terrorist law of 2006, is a key point for consolidating the anti-terrorist discourse towards Chechnya. A counter-terrorist operation area can be declared, according to the law, on any territory with a large number of residents, where several rights are restricted and constitutional guarantees are not ensured. In actual fact, Chechnya was already under counter-terrorist operations since 1999 in a near state of exceptions with no legal basis for its support. In other words, the anti-terrorist law rendered legal number of operations already being undertaken in the field. And the amalgam between Chechnya and the anti-terrorist operation area helps to consolidate the association between a whole republic and terrorism, because the 100% of Chechnya was under KTO. Well, that's just an example from the metro here. This from this year, but well, I do not have time for that. As I said, the portrayal of Chechens as terrorists was not built from a vacuum, but rather was based on pre-existing cliches and stereotypes. Since the conquest of the Caucasus, a series of generally negative representations progressively took root in Russian popular culture. I will not extend too much on this, but a dual representation of Chechens prevailed during the 19th century in the work of authors such as Pushkin, Lermontov and Tolstoy. On the one hand, the Chechens embodied the noble savage in the antipodes of the vicious life in the Tsarist state. But on the other hand, the Chechen also appears as an inherently violent barbarian who has to be civilized. The Chechen also appears as the bandit. In a way or in another, this image of Chechens as the other who is to be feared and fought was actualized in different contexts. By the mid-20th century, the deportation of the whole Chechen and Ingush population to Central Asia was based on the accusation of their supposed collaboration with Nazi Germany. Thus, Stalin nurtured the association between Chechens and fascists. Later on, between the 70s and 80s, the image of Chechens started to be associated with the mafia and the grey economy of the Soviet Union, particularly through the media, through popular literature and detective series shown on television. I have watched some of them in YouTube actually. They are very interesting. So, in 1991, they became, the nationalists trying to destroy the unity of Russia, the unity of the brotherhood of nations in Russia. And well, of course, this the already explained naturalization or petrification of characteristics, of national characteristics assigned to each ethnic group or nationality living in the Russian Empire first and then in the Soviet Union, facilitated the appearance of these cliches, enabling the perpetuation of the stereotypes. So this naturalization of the so-called national characteristics allows explaining Chechen's supposed instinctive propensity to crime in all its forms. So finally, the study case. The Murtazalieva affair dates from 2004-2005. She was found guilty and spent 8 years and a half in prison. Not surprisingly, the portrayed image of Murtazalieva in the media and during her trial is consistent with the characteristic of the state Islamic threat at the general level. From the interviews with actors having been present in the trial, the verdict and the media articles, I remarked the following recurrent features that, let's put it this way, brand someone a terrorist in the 2000s. So, well, of course, belonging to Chechen ethnic group or just being Caucasian, that's for sure. But it's very interesting, a non-traditional way of life for women. Given the phenomenon of the black widows and the naturalization of the said ethno-national characteristics, a young Chechen woman living alone, this is without a man, very sexist, in Moscow is not perceived as a traditional behavior for a Chechen woman. So this deviation was considered as a sign of radicalization. The perception of a high religiosity, because she often spoke of Islam, she used to go to the mosque, she read Muslim literature. Related to this point, the perception of religious proselytism, because during the trial it was very clear, but in a very subtle way, this fear of Murtazalieva trying to recruit young ethnic Russian girls into jihad and trying to convert them to Islam and then to the jihadist cause. Well, being critical on the military operations in Chechnya, she was recording in many times, secretly of course, and so talking about human rights violations in Chechen war was considered as inciting ethnic hatred towards Russians, and was also considered as psychological preparation through the girls to whom she was, well, she it's a very long story, but she was, never mind. Very long history. Finally, suspicions of international links. We have already said that the anti-terrorist discourse considered violent radicalization a product of foreign Islam and global jihadist organization. Real or supposed links with international Islamic networks entail the suspicion of radicalization. In this case, false records of travels within or outside of Russia are invoked to underline her international mobility in jihadist circles. This is the last thing. Reinterpretation of the First Chechen War. This is the support of separatist efforts in the first half of the 90s is reinterpreted in light of the Islamic threat. Those with real or imagined involvement in the First War or with the separatist government are seen as potential terrorists. A retrospective labeling is carried out not only on events but also on actors or figures like, for example, Dudayev. In the case of Murtazalieva, an invaded past as a sniper during the First Chechen War was attributed to her, and this was presented as a proof of her commitment to jihad. Indeed, in the trial and in the media also, a life quite similar to Basayev's was attributed to her: international mobility, participation in the First War, engagement into jihad. Moreover, and this is also very interesting, at least for me, the possession of revolutionary music, this is Vysotsky and Timur Mutsarayev, was invoked during the trial in order to demonstrate her supposed radicalization. Спасибо.